Boa tarde, pessoal. Vamos começar esse painel. Meu nome é Luiz Alberto. Alguns anos atrás, eu fui um dos presidentes dessa conferência e estou muito feliz de estar de volta e ver a grande potência que essa conferência, que começou com algumas salas no campus, se tornar esse grande mega evento, que é um dos principais fóruns do nosso país. Um dos principais objetivos da gente criar a Brasil Conference e fazer a Brasil Conference é trazer grandes exemplos a nível mundial e aplicá-los no contexto brasileiro. E é por isso que foi montado esse painel tão especial hoje.
O nosso próximo painel de tecnologia e inovação é com o Justin Mateen, cofundador do Tinder, o Henrique Dubugras, cofundador e co-CEO da Brex, e moderado pelo Jorge Paulo Lemann, que eu tenho certeza que todos aqui sabem quem é. Muito obrigada.
Bom dia a todos. É português ou inglês? English.
English, yeah.
Good morning. Well, I'm supposed to introduce two gentlemen here. Henrique Dubugras, everybody knows him in Brazil. He's the founder of Brex. I've known him since he was 14 or 15, and I actually tried to get him to go to Stanford. And he was accepted at Stanford, and after 6 months there,
6 months, yeah.
he decided to quit. He had better things to do. I complained to him that, how about the money I lent you to go to Stanford? And he said, oh, I'm going to pay you in Brex shares. And I said, what price? Oh, $20 million. I said, but you don't even have an office. And no, $20 million. But I said, okay, whatever you say is fine. So he gave us some shares, which I gave to the Lehman Foundation. And as you know, the last round of Brex, was it how many billion?
12.
$12 billion, so.
0.3.
Yeah. So it turned out to be a good investment. Justin is the founder of Tinder, which is a very successful dating company, and he has left Tinder lately, and he is an investor now. He's doing very interesting things in the investment world. He's a very thoughtful person, also has opinions on everything. And so he should be an interesting speaker, and like that. And, well, do you want to say something before we get going?
Thanks for switching to English.
Well, Justin, why don't you get going by talking a little bit about your experience at Tinder and what you have done and what you have built, especially what you have learned in recent times about how to conduct business and how to adjust to this ever-changing world.
I think that, you know, like you said, the world's constantly changing, and you have to adapt, you know, to the times for any type of business in any region. And, you know, the challenge with Tinder at that time was trying to break stigma with dating, because I don't know if you guys recall, but back in 2012, you know, you would find a different demographic using dating apps. It would be your divorced, weird uncle that would be, you know, trying to look for someone to date. And I think that if you think about it, you know, young people, college students like yourselves, a lot of you that are in college, I guess some of you are not, really have a need for a product like Tinder, right? Where you're craving social interactions, you want to meet new people, but there wasn't a product back then that really allowed you guys to feel comfortable using a dating platform. So basically the essence of Tinder was to easily onboard new users and make you feel comfortable with the product. And the way that we broke stigma was by getting a highly social demographic to use the product first. Getting celebrities and people that were perceived as cool. And we found that once you had those users, it would trickle down to everyone else. So rather than acquiring users and trying to build a massive platform overnight, we grew more organically. It took longer, but that's what allowed us to break stigma, I would say.
And you guys were in colleges a lot too. Wasn't that a big part of the strategy? What was the college strategy?
It was. We leveraged, fraternities and sororities, and use that as a platform to launch in the U.S.
You have some numbers? I mean, how many people did you really get together, and what did they look like?
Well, I love numbers, so you got to be more specific.
Numbers.
But early on, we were growing. The first month we had about 3,000 users. By the third month, we were at 50,000 users to end December of 2012. In January, we grew from 50,000 users to 450,000 users. So we grew 900% in 1 month. And at that time, the back end wasn't working at all. So we were registering less than 10% of profile ratings. So people would log on and they would end up seeing the same person. And as a user, you'd think that that's because we ran out of people to show you, but it wasn't the case. We just weren't registering the action that you were taking. So it was a very scary time.
I thought that was a feature. I got many shots at the same girl, Yeah.
You only need one shot, Enrique. You found Laura. Enrique, so.
Do you check on the success rate of your dating, and has it been, have relationships improved because of you or not, or do?
I'd like to believe so. So one really interesting thing that happened early on with Tinder, we realized that there were, random facts and data that, in articles that I was unaware of. But for instance, the NBA road percentage, in terms of winning percentage, increased because a lot of athletes used to go out when they were out of state and try to find someone to, I guess, have a fun night with. And as a result of Tinder, they didn't have to necessarily go out and do the same thing. So the percentage of wins increased over time. Now, if you're asking to be more specific about how people interacted with the platform, it was very interesting because early on, what we found was that males who were looking for females, so basically straight men, would say yes 80% of the time. They'd just be sitting there like, yes, 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 yes. And women, unfortunately, for men, for straight men, are way more thoughtful and don't just say yes to everyone. So the percentage was more like 8 or 9%, and they would say no to over 90% of men.
Girls are always difficult.
Yeah. And then we found that for gay men, it was actually, they were somewhere in the middle in terms of how how specific they were in terms of what they were looking for, and it was around 35 to 40% of the time they would swipe right. So there's a lot of very interesting stats like that we learned. But yeah.
Enrique, why don't you update us? Last time we spoke at a conference together, you were very much into remote office and permitting people to work everywhere and like that. And so what have you been doing lately, and how is the remote office working?
Yeah, for sure. So, George, last time I was in this conference, actually, I think it was 2019, and if someone asked me what I thought about remote work, I said it's for people who don't like working. That was my standard response. And at Brex, we were like completely saying there's absolutely no way we're going to do remote working. It's impossible to build a culture. People are just going to not work, or work in their underwears the whole day. Like, we're not into this. Like, it's not going to be for us. People who do it are jokesters. A few years forward, we're now probably one of the first companies that actually announced that we're going to be remote first forever, and our entire company is remote. First quarter of 2019, 100% of the people we hired were in the Bay Area. First quarter, San Francisco Bay Area. First quarter of 2021, 73% of the people we hired were outside of the Bay Area, and 40% of the people that we hired were outside of any city that we had an office before. So more than 70 miles from like San Francisco, New York, Salt Lake City, and Vancouver, which is where we had offices before. Over 40% of our people already in a lot of different places. I think we hired a little bit over 50 people in Brazil already. We had people in almost all the states in the US. And I think we are extremely committed to remote work. And I cannot even imagine a world in which, at least for Brex, we went back to the office. So extremely bullish on it. And there was a lot of lessons, and I can probably talk the whole hour about, all the lessons. But I think that I would say, what is the biggest advantage and the biggest issue with it? The biggest advantage is just the amount of talent, right? Before, we used to cater and need to hire, for us, engineers, right? Like people who write code and product and design, like those are the people who are in scarcity, and we needed to hire a lot of them. It's very expensive. A lot of them didn't work that much, and so it was kind of really hard to hire, in the Bay Area. Now we're hiring all these people everywhere. The pool of talent increased so much that before it was like, hey, will we be able to hire 30 engineers this quarter? Now we just pick in a spreadsheet how many engineers we want, and they just magically appear. Because the size of the talent pool increased so much. There's so many amazing and talented people around the world that we were able to hire them and and do and they're doing a really good job. And then the next question that people asked, right, is, are the engineers in the Bay Area just better than the engineers in the other places, right? Because I think that's like a pretty like reasonable question. What I'll tell you is the following: they're not smarter, but because they have had experiences in companies who have seen scale and the best practices, they acquire these experiences and they are able to deliver much faster because they had these experiences. But at Brex, what happened is when you mix them up, so we hire an engineer in Brazil, 6 months after they're in Brex, they're producing the same or even more of a Bay Area engineer. So the mingling of and the teaching that comes from and the learning of the best practices that comes from having the kind of like best engineering practices, best product practice in the world with the rest of the world is very good. And I think that's like an extremely positive trend for the world, because what's going to happen is like, look, we're hiring these 50 people in Brazil. I hope they stay for a long time, but in tech, as it's rare that people stay more than 5 years. And what they're going to do is they're going to go and they're going to start their own companies, right? Hopefully in Brazil. And they're starting their own companies in Brazil with all the knowledge they learned with Brex, with people from all these other companies that they worked from. And I think they're going to have a lot more chances of success because they learned the best practices and seeing what's happening there. So I think for the world, there's this just big generational thing that's going to happen in which the knowledge is now going to be going from a place where it's super concentrated in California to now the rest of the world. And companies are going to be able to be started anywhere in the world and still be very successful by learning from the best practices that Silicon Valley, at least in technology, developed over the last many years. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, there's one problem with remote that we still haven't solved, and I haven't seen anyone solving it, which is training out of college people. Like, when you get out of college, your first job, being next to someone, being in the office with the other people that are also out of college, with a very close manager and mentor that's helping you and teaching you everything, that's how you learn, right? Like, that is how we thought our out-of-college students, I guess, with in George's companies, how they thought out-of-college, is that very strong, like mentorship. That is really hard remotely, much harder than it was in person. We have not solved that at Brex. What happens is we just hire probably fewer out-of-college students because of that, which is an unfortunate circumstance. And but I think it's going to get better. I think, look, we're in the worst place of remote work than we'll ever be in our lives. This is like the worst it's ever going to be. 5 years from now, the more best practices are going to be invented, more companies, more tactics, more everything. So I think that there's a long way to go here, but that I would say is the downside that is unsolved, I would say, by remote today.
So basically, you never want to work again?
Enrique, why do you think people like Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan don't really believe that much in remote work and want people to come back to the office?
Well, I think that, if you get somewhere like banking, right, where people are working 100-hour weeks, if you're working 100-hour weeks on Zoom, that's pretty hard. If you're working 100-hour weeks with your buddies in the office, ordering pizza at 1 a.m. and building stories, right, I think it's much easier to do. So especially, again, for this, I think JP Morgan is famous also for having this huge trainee program that then, they become the investment bankers and et cetera, et cetera. I think that's one. The other thing is the bigger you are, the harder it is to change, right? Like when we went into remote, we were 400 people, we're 1,100 now. So more than 50% of the people at Brex were onboarded remotely, started working remotely, and self-selected for people who already liked remote. Otherwise, they wouldn't have joined us, right? If you have 100,000 people that decided to join an office and only know how to work in an office, and it's much harder to adapt in a younger and smaller company like us.
And Justin, you've been making a lot of investments in startups, and that's what you do now. And what's your experience with remote work? Are you in favor of it? Do you agree with Enrique, or do you have another point of view after making, what do you have now, some 200 investments?
Yeah, something like that. I'm generally in favor of remote work, but I think it really boils down to the actual company, the business that you're trying to build, and the culture that you're trying to build. And for certain types of businesses, you benefit from the human interaction and being able to walk over and speak to someone, maybe certain departments of a company. But I think, mainly for the fact that it increases like Enrique just mentioned, it increases the potential pool size that you could hire from. I'm strongly in favor of remote work, as long as you have some sort of digital product that still will allow a certain culture to exist within the organization. You don't want a bunch of people that are working from home who don't feel like they're a part of a larger organization that they all believe in. So it really boils down to being an effective leader, and I think in the case of Brex, Enrique and Pedro have been able to build that culture effectively.
What do you think about remote work, Georgia?
I like it for myself. But, I'm on Zoom a lot these days, and whereas previously sort of had to be traveling all over and like that, so I think it's great. And I think it works for various types of companies. For others, it doesn't work. I think the training of younger people is a problem if you can't get them into the office and like that. But I think it's going to keep growing, remote work, and eventually people will figure out the kinds of businesses that work well with remote work and those that don't. And, people will also have the choice whether they want to work in a company that's all remote work or whether they prefer actually going to the office, being with other people and like that. So I think the market will find its way and will adjust to whatever works better. Now, you're both in businesses which are having a lot of changes. Everything is moving, everything is changing. what are you doing to keep up with these changes? And what kind of culture do you want in your companies so that you can keep up with these changes? I'm interested in that because, you know, we're in big companies, slow moving and like that, and we have to adjust. So I want to learn from you guys what you're doing to adjust and how you keep up with change.
I can start, or if you want to start? I think that if I were to distill, one of my biggest mistakes over the last 5 years with Brex was reading too many business books. And I say that because you read all these business books and you come up with all these strategy frameworks, and they're beautiful, they're amazing. Oh my God, there's so much clarity in the strategy and how other companies do it, and you know, all of that. But the problem when you're too focused on strategy is that you forget about the customer, you know, the person who you're actually selling to. So if I could go back in Brex and spend all the time I spent reading business books, talking to customers, understanding how they're thinking, understanding why they're choosing the things that they choose, right? Instead of thinking about too much about like our internal stuff, that's what I would do. And you know, I think there's a lot to be learned there. I think the thing that I'm also realizing now, you know, I was always the youngest person in the room, like literally everywhere I went, right? Like remember, you know, I met George, I was 15. He took me to meet a bunch of people. I was always younger than everyone. Now there's a company that I am an investor and I mentor that's worth $1 billion. The founder's 21. So he's 5 years younger than I am. And so I'm not longer the youngest person in the room. And I have, you know, for me, I'm understanding that there is this next generation of, you know, people who are now totally adults. Like people who are 18 today, they were born in 2004. Think about that. They never lived in a world which Facebook didn't exist. They never lived. Like they were born and Facebook already existed from day one. Like how does this generation think, right? If you don't spend time with them and you don't understand think about how they think about the world, and you assume that everyone is kind of similar to yourself or your preferences, or even the millennials, right, which is, you know, then the generation we've all been studying for a while. There's this whole new generation there now that is an adults and making decisions and creating culture and moving the world. For us, what kind of businesses are they creating? What kind of businesses are they interested in? You know, what kind of things they are doing, right? I think those are some of the things that today I try to spend time on, is a lot more time with customers, a lot less time on, you know, business books. So that would be my thing.
I think you're doing a good job. The fact that you're here today means that you value and have a pulse on the next generation, which is typically, you know, college kids. It's the most highly aspirational demographic in society, I would say. I think when you're younger, you can't wait to go to college. When you graduate, you can't wait. You wish that you were still in college, but the reality is that I think it's really important for companies to have a good pulse in terms of where the world is heading, and you know, the easiest way to do that is just look to people that are younger than you. As you grow older, you have to look further down. Enrique saying that he's old is kind of funny to me because I'm starting to feel old, but it's like...
I'm sorry, you're old, man.
I know. But the way that Enrique probably felt towards the person he's mentoring that is 21 is probably how I felt when I first met Enrique, and I was like, you know, how is this young guy doing, you know, so well, and has the focus that he has, both internally, but for the organization as a whole. So, you know, I kind of lost track of your question, but I definitely look for founders.
Keep up with
yes,
change.
I definitely look to founders who have strong opinions and believe in whatever it is that they're doing, but are also humble enough to realize that the answer that they have today may not be the answer that they need tomorrow. recognizing that and then being able to quickly adjust. One concern that I have as organizations scale, and I think relates back to remote work, is sometimes organizations, like, I believe that if you cannot identify, if something goes wrong, if you can't pinpoint what went wrong or who made the mistake, then you're probably overhiring or remote work isn't working for you. I think that a lot of companies right now may have a much larger pool of people to hire from and can end up overhiring as well. So I think you have to be careful that you don't fall into that trap.
We have a lot of entrepreneurs here, or budding entrepreneurs in the room. So what advice do you have to them who are starting up companies? What are the important things they should be looking at and be concerned with to be successful?
So my biggest piece of advice is, if you're starting a company right now, by definition, startups have limited capital and limited resources. So your time is probably the most important aspect of that, because today there's a lot of money that's out there and people can pretty much raise money for any idea. So I think that when you're starting a business, rather than just saying I want to start a business, I think that you need to really feel that sense of drive for whatever it is that you're building. Usually, I would suggest that you start in a market that's really, really big, because in order to succeed, you would need a small fraction of the market size, let's say 1%, whereas a lot of people are focused on emerging, like an emerging space that really, you end up starting 5 or 10 years prematurely. It's not so bad to actually wait, see how the market matures, and then go into it once you have more data and you could learn from the mistakes of others and improve upon that. And I think the most important thing to remember is that nobody really knows what they're doing the first time they start a company, the second time, the third time. The world is changing so fast, you just have to kind of jump in, trust your instincts, and learn from your mistakes as best you can. I think the most important thing that I've seen in founders that have succeeded is that they're extremely data-driven. They really care about the consumer and making sure that the product works, and I think the rest follows. Like, founders that are focused on fundraising, that's not that important, because if you're doing well, money will just come to you regardless. I think that spending 1 or 2% of your time constantly fundraising is far more effective than, all of a sudden saying, okay, I want to raise my Series A and try to raise, X amount of dollars and give yourself a month to do it and then spend most of your time focused on that. And I think the reason is twofold. A, there's a sense of desperation because you've created a time limit for yourself. And B, you lose focus on the core business. So I think Enrique probably falls into this, where he's constantly spending like 1 or 2% of his time speaking to outside investors, internal investors, and as a result, when he's ready to raise a round, I think it just falls together on its own, and it's really easy because there's people waiting in line to invest. And at the same time, he's laser focused on the business and isn't distracted by the fundraise over a long period of time.
Well, my first advice is, if you already have a good idea, you should raise money from Justin and Georgia, great investors. But what I would say is, like, one thing that I learned is, like, if you can find an idea in a place where the macro is helping you, it really, really helps. So when we were starting Pagarment, our first company, payments was just starting to open up in Brazil. right? There was only a duopoly, and it was starting to open up the payments markets with, more acquirers and online businesses. And so there was like a push from the market in some way that even like we started with some value proposition, then we iterated it over time and got something better. But we were in a market that it was a growing market that people cared about. There was a lot of capital in it. And I think fintech in general, right, was that over the last, 10 years or so. Like there's a lot of just general macro trends that were pushing fintech forward. And I think it's true for fintech. Obviously a lot less greenfield there now than there was 10 years ago. And I think that every moment in time, there's a few macro trends that are kind of going to help your business with everything, right? And I know it sounds like a little bit lame because like everything is AI today, everything is Web3, right? Everything is, NFTs. But the reality is a lot of talent want to join AI companies. A lot of talent want to join Web3 companies. A lot of investors want to invest in, these kinds of companies. So having being part of a broader narrative gives you a lot of flexibility in hiring and fundraising that will allow you to then pivot and change and have that ground space. So I wouldn't restrict myself just for that, but I would say if you can find an idea that you're passionate about in a place that is in a market that's growing and there's good momentum, I think it helps a lot. The second thing I would say is the best way to train to be a founder is being a founder. Before I started Pagarme, which was my first company, I had tried and failed 2 or 3 companies before. And then Pagarme, was an okay success. Obviously, Brex is much bigger. But I could never have done Brex without having done Pagarme. So I would say maybe the only other training to start a company is working at a small company that is successful. I think I invest in literally every single company that comes out of Brex employees because I do think that Brex was a great training ground for them, and they're gonna do super. I think a lot of them have a good chance of success. But I'd say other than that, the best way to train to start a company is just starting a company. Try it, do it, iterate, fail. The next one, a lot of founders today are second or third or even fourth time founders before their company hit. So you just keep, and it seems like an overnight success. It seems like, oh my God, it was just, how many companies did you try before Tinder? Like 1 or 2, right? Yeah, 1 company. So oh wow, Tinder is like this overnight success, but there's a company before that fit, same thing with us. So I would just start doing it, start trying it. There's this whole debate around college, which we probably shouldn't get into, but
Well, there's a new word that I learned today. What was it called?
Complexo de vira-lata.
Vira-lata. So I think that Brazilians in general are extremely smart, highly family-oriented and warm people. And they have a perception of Brazil that is far more negative than I think the rest of the world. I think that people look at Brazil and they actually are amazed by the people, the culture, and also the economy. So 50% of Latin America, Brazil on its own is the same size as all of Latin America, the rest of Latin America. And also VC dollars, if you look at it, I guess, more than 50% of the dollars are going towards Brazil. So I think the hardest thing is just deciding that you're actually gonna start a business. It's like writing the hardest paragraph to write in an essay or whatever or the first sentence is the hardest sentence. So it's like, just dive in. Don't expect to have all the answers because nobody does. And anyone that tells you that they do is probably misleading you. So have the confidence to put the first step forward and walk and eventually run. I think that's the most valuable lesson that one can have when they're starting a business.
I have a question for both of you. So whenever you meet an entrepreneur and you're deciding, should I invest, should I not invest in this person, what are the traits that you look for to make that decision?
Basically, believe a lot in people, so companies I've invested in, I've always concerned with who are the people who are there, who are running it, and entrepreneurs, are they fanatics? Are they really going to push this? Do they really believe in what they're doing, and how hard will they work? Will they be able to attract a good team to work with them and lead this team? And as you mentioned, is this a business that makes sense in the macro world of today, and does the business have potential? But basically, I'm more interested in the entrepreneur than the business itself.
I look for a lot of the same things, especially when you're looking at an early stage company. Essentially, all you have is the founder, and there's certain things that you need to believe that they can effectively do. Being able to tell the story. Well, let's rewind. If you think about why companies fail, they typically fail for one or two of these two reasons. They either run out of capital, they can't raise money for whatever reason, they don't hit the next milestone, or they're not effective in terms of hiring the best talent. There's only so much that one person can do as the founder, and I think the best way to de-risk that is being able to tell the story, your long-term vision for the company in a really effective way. So I want to make sure when I do this like weird test with myself when I'm speaking to a founder, can I visualize this founder, 5 or 10 years from now, managing a $10 billion plus company? Like, do they have what it takes to get there? Which was actually the first time I met Enrique, I was very certain that he does have that. I think the other characteristics that you look for are, that I look for, I want the founder to be extremely driven, and almost to a point that it's unreasonable, where they prioritize the business above anything and everything else. And I need to really understand where they derive their motivation. What's driving them? Why will this person keep moving forward when a normal person would give up? And understanding where that comes from, I think, is very important.
Yeah, one thing that you say that I actually agree very strongly with is the motivation can come from anywhere, right? It can be, you're pissed that your high school girlfriend dumped you and you want to show it to her, you're like, it's money, it's mission, like whatever it is, as long as it's there and you're going to keep grinding and working, motivations, they change over time, right? Like they will get more pure and, more beautiful, but early on, like whatever the motivation is, as long as it's there,
doesn't matter where it comes from.
It works.
Okay, what are the macro trends that you see now that you would be very interested in following or investing in? And how do you see virtual reality, and how do you put virtual reality into those macro trends which you are interested in?
So one macro trend that we've been discussing that's a part of this panel is remote work. I was lucky and fortunate because I actually already believed. I haven't had an office in over 5 years, so I can't blame COVID for working from home. And sometimes my wife didn't like that I was working from home, but I think at this point it's socially accepted, so I think we're good. But there was a company called Deal, for instance, which was focused on remote work and being able to hire independent contractors internationally. Before COVID happened, I invested in this company years ago at like a $15 million valuation. And I think, what Enrique mentioned earlier in terms of trends, when there are obvious trends and there's a lot of money and talent that wants to work for those companies, they have a lot of positive momentum. And I think, in a very short period of time, that's now a $5.5 billion company that has the potential to be a $50 billion company, because they're really capitalizing on this trend where you can hire people anywhere. So that's something that that's a big trend that I'm looking at. But I also look at companies that are succeeding in the U.S. that I've invested in, or like for instance, Enrique and Brex. Early on, when I saw that Brex was working, I tried to find similar businesses in other regions right? Because if you think about it, it's already a proven model that works, and there's certain territories that are either being ignored or companies like Brex will not focus on for years. So I invested in a company called Clara in Mexico, or Contas Simples in Brazil, which some of you may be familiar with, and then found a similar business in Africa called Float, and then one in Southeast Asia called VoloPay. None of these companies are doing the exact same thing, and you can't expect to copy a business that works in the US or another region and have it work in that emerging market. So you need a founder that's extremely thoughtful in terms of their approach and product for that local region, both from a cultural standpoint and also a regulatory standpoint, especially when it comes to fintech. But usually when something works, it'll work in a different region. You just have to figure out the exact mechanics and what the product looks like. So, you don't get extra points for reinventing the wheel and starting completely from scratch. That doesn't mean you won't be rewarded for starting an unbelievable business in the US that's a first mover. But I think that there's a lot of trends that we're seeing, just companies that work in the US that you can kind of replicate in emerging markets.
Yeah. I love to think about the second and third order effects of things, right? So iPhones came out. What's the second order effect of an iPhone came out? Well, if you have GPS, then you can have delivery apps or Uber, right? Like, because you have your GPS, you can order things. And if that's true, oh wow, now there's all these Uber drivers and gig economy and DoorDash drivers and all these people. Okay, since they exist, now is this huge part of the economy and they're going to keep growing. What are the services we can provide to them? Or what is going to change about the world if like 10% of our country's population is gig economy, right? So there's all these second and third order effects. So in terms of remote work, I think a lot about, and even going outside of tech, right, just thinking a little bit about real estate is like, look, if you work in New York City and you have kids and now you don't have to commute to the office every day, where will you live? What are the real estate opportunities like a little bit further from the city that were underexplored before, right? Or if you are, I invested in a business recently around, no, sorry, I didn't invest, but I think Brex is a customer around like doing like automated offsites. Like in Brex, just in March, we ran 63 concurrent offsites. So 63 teams were meeting in March and doing offsites, like companies that automate and help that happen. So because of the macro trend remote work, what is going to change about the world? And what are the second and third order effects that happen because of that? And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity lies, because kind of like Justin said, like I think the people who are like, very early in the market, it may or may not work, but if they grind enough and that market grows, you grow with it. So if you're not that, right, you're not the early, remote work player, you're a little bit now later in the game, 2 years in, 3 years in, what are the second order effects and business opportunities that you can find that are a consequence of that macro trend? And I think that's super interesting.
And virtual reality?
So Brex, before it was Brex, it was a virtual reality company. It's called Beyond, and we pivoted the company to be Brex. I would say I do still think it's a little bit more away than people expect. I think it is going to happen. And there are going to be companies that are going to be very successful because they're betting it in since now. There's some use cases. So I met this like movie director that said that she was designing a set fully on virtual reality, to be able to like design a set and, some specific applications like that. But I would say I haven't thought about it enough, and I don't. It wouldn't be my pick if I were to pick one if I was a student right now. But I think it's super interesting. It's going to be big in the future.
I agree with Enrique. I think that there are actually some interesting companies in the space. I still think that there hasn't been a true platform shift, and that it won't happen for many years. So, as an investor or a founder, I wouldn't necessarily be jumping into VR right now unless I have an angle that I'm really certain of.
But to be clear, I've been wrong about this before, so I was not super pro crypto 5 years ago.
Being wrong made Brex really right.
Both of you have, are dealt with investments in Brazil and investments in the U.S. What is the big difference that you have found out, and how can Brazil improve?
I think that anytime you start a company, you need to have tremendous perseverance and grit. I think it's more true in Brazil because you have also a regulatory hurdle, like regulatory hurdles to get across, and there's certain challenges. Like from an outsider, Brazil is a very appealing market, but it's also, I think people are starting to realize it's a very difficult market to crack. Just because you're successful in other parts of Latin America doesn't mean you could just go into Brazil and win. So I think being really thoughtful and understanding the Brazilian culture is extremely important when speaking to founders. So it's much more challenging if someone moved to Brazil a couple of years ago and they're starting a company there. I think that their likelihood of success is way less than someone that grew up in Brazil and really understands how to navigate certain pitfalls that they'll have to deal with as they build the company.
I think that Brazil is still a country that if you look at least, this is my perception from the outside, I've been out for a while, but capital is still a moat in Brazil in some ways. It's not that every company can raise a lot of money, there's not a lot of money. So if you look at some of the most successful companies in Brazil, they've been able to come to the US, raise money here and deploy it there at, it was 5.8, now I think it's 4 point something, times more. So I do think that one very important trait, if I'm investing in a Brazilian founder, and I know this is going to sound lame, but it's like knowing how to speak English pretty well. Because I do think that it is a very big advantage still to come here, talk to the hedge fund guys here, or the VCs, raise some money from Brazil and grow pretty fast and execute some of the playbooks. And I think I've met so many companies that invested in Brazil and they're super good companies, and then they come here and no one understands what they're doing. No one understands why what they're doing matters. And then some competitor that I think the founder is worse, but speaks English really well and knows how to talk the jargon in Silicon Valley, raises 100 times more money, and then attracts all the talent, gains all the market share, and grows really quickly. So I think all of you here that are students in U.S. universities, you have a massive advantage, to go back to Brazil and start a business there. You are here, you understand the business culture, you understand the terms, the jargon, the English. I think that is a very, very big advantage. And, I think, George, since your days, coming to the U.S. was a big advantage, right? And
very much.
Yeah, and
very much.
Understanding what was happening here and being able to attract that to Brazil. So I think that, I do, when I'm investing in Brazil, I think someone who understands a little bit of how the American and the U.S. culture works to be able to learn what's working here, etc. I think that's one. And number two is this thing around talent, is this obsession of talent. The reality is it's very hard to hire a lot of great people, in Latin America. There's something about this startup ecosystem that is about, hey, because you worked at, let's say PayPal, you learned a lot of things about how PayPal works, then you go to the next startup and we skip already all those mistakes that person learned from PayPal, and then they go to Stripe and then they learn a bunch of stuff, and then so there's a lot of knowledge that's shared, across companies, and the Brazilian ecosystem now is just starting to have some of that, right? With Nubank and Lop and a few of these other successes of people who learn in these high growth companies and can be hired. So I think the ability to attract talent, and this obsession about having the best people work in your company, because there's not a lot of them in Brazil, so you can't assume it's true. I think it's something I particularly care a lot about when looking in Brazil and, building a company there.
Both of you have been very successful. How do you deal with success, and what problems have you come across in dealing with success?
I think the most important thing that I've learned is I'm generally extremely curious, so I never wanted to lose that. I constantly want to learn and improve, and I think that you could learn from anyone, regardless of what they're doing or who they are. So intellectual curiosity, I think, is very important. And then I would also say not taking yourself too seriously. There was a moment when I first had my first major liquidity, and I was at a meeting with someone, and I recall they were taking me too seriously almost. So I went to the bathroom, and I kind of looked at myself in the mirror, and I'm like, what's going on? It's like you just can't take yourself too seriously, and I think you also surround yourself with other people that are going through similar situations, so you could learn from them, and not necessarily try to adapt or make any major changes too quickly.
I would say that for me, I think self-awareness is probably one of the most important things that you need to develop with success, because you think that you're immune to some of the cliches that happen, right? Like you get too successful and then you think you're too smart or too good, right? And you're not wrong because you got it right so many times. And I think like understanding that you're not immune to that. Like, you will have, some ego problems, right? You will think you're better than you are, right? Like, you will go through these phases in which you're not as good as everyone is telling you are, And for me, that was super important because, since I was 15, I had, journalists and people tell you, oh my God, Enrique, he's the genius, he's so smart, he's so good. And if enough people tell you, you start believing it, And I think understanding that that's not the case, and you need systems around your life to, come back and say, hey, you're not that good, You may think you are, but you're not. And I think building those systems around you to make sure you ground yourself, and understanding that all those things that people say that happen when you're successful, they can happen to you. And you need to be aware. And how do you have people in your life or systems or even trigger words, that will say, hey, like I probably should, do a look inside and reevaluate everything. So.
What about you?
Well, me.
Yes, I'm curious too.
No, just don't believe too much what are the same. Be yourself and stay humble if possible, and always be thinking about how you can improve, always, and improve yourself and improve the world. So I think that's the way to deal with it. And, so we got a war going on out there, but do you believe that the world is getting better? And what are each one of you going to do to make the world better in the next couple of years?
I believe strongly that the world is getting better. Very, very, very strongly. Like I think if, almost to the point that, it's almost irrational to not think so, right? If you just look in data and you not look about 1 year, but you look at like 10, 20, 50, 100 years, like the world is getting better. And I think for me, the thing that touches my heart are two things. The first one is entrepreneurship, and how do I help businesses go further and more people start businesses. I do believe that business is the lifeblood of our society and capitalism, and not that it's the only thing, but it's my thing. It's the thing that I'm choosing to help. My company serves businesses. I care about entrepreneurship, so I'm picking that as my thing. And other people can pick other things, but that's my thing. And second thing is Brazil. I think we've been doing well in the U.S., and I think we have this huge advantage. And when I look at Brazil, there's not a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. Obviously, George is leading the way, of all his philanthropy and inspiration. And I think when I look forward, I would choose 10 times more to spend my time and money helping Brazil than, having Stanford's endowment go from 30 billion to 31, you know, so I definitely would very much focus on that.
I think that's a loaded question to end on. But I think generally speaking, there's good things and bad things happening all around the world at any given time. And I think I'm an optimist, and there's definitely more good happening. One way that I try to help is through investing in strong founders all around the world, similar to what Enrique said. And it's really amazing because you actually can see that change in a relatively short period of time, where there's some countries with a very small tech ecosystem that's developing. You know, you notice it on a monthly basis, where there's new founders, friends of the founders that you've invested in that are starting new businesses and all that. And I think they really are making impact on lives, especially when they can leapfrog and go from, you know, one, you know, basically skip something that they never had and go to the next thing that they could have. Now, I think that the answer to many of the world's problems are actually a lack of education and a lack of empathy. So I think that I'm more attracted towards helping, you know, in any way I can in terms of educating, furthering education. And I think that today, especially with everything that's going on, it's really sad to see what's happening. And I've realized that the more you know about someone, if you really truly understand someone's life or upbringing or the way that they were raised, it's hard to lack empathy. And I think if you could be empathetic towards anyone and everyone, the world's at a better place. So it's like, I would challenge you, someone that you don't particularly like, try having a conversation with them over the next few days if you can, and just understand who they are and where they came from. And I think just understanding that will warm you up in terms of how you perceive them.
So, George, I have one question to you to end before.
We've run out of time.
We have 20 seconds, 20 seconds. When you come here next year, I'm sure you're going to be here again. What will you want to have accomplished over the next year?
We have an election going on in Brazil, and we'll have a new president. And, you know, my basic objective in Brazil is to try to improve education. And so getting ready to, we have a whole kit of how to improve education in Brazil. And I'm looking forward to the possibility of introducing this kit and the things we've been working on for years now, and actually make some headway in terms of improving education in Brazil, which I think is what the country most needs and what it's necessary for it to be successful over, you know, the next couple of decades and like that. So I think that's the main thing I'm looking for, and the things we've been trying to improve in education and get them really going and be effective in terms of making more Brazilians being able to participate in the economy or startups or even being competitive in the world like that. Well, we've run out of time. Thank you very much. And I wish you all the success in the world. And let's get out there and let's improve entrepreneurship, and let's improve Brazil with it, and let's get going. Keep going.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Georgie.